Welcome to another episode of our video series of the mechanics of human cognition.
It's great to be here. I have to say, I've really been looking forward to this one. The subject matter is, well, it's about as charged as it gets in our society today. How have you been?
I'm doing great, thank you. And you're right, this is a heavy one. We're jumping straight into gender, equality, roles, all of it.
All the big topics.
Exactly. And I think our mission today has to be very clear. We're looking at this through a strictly biological and anthropological lens. We have to sidestep the usual social debates to get to the core of it.
That's the only way. To really get why we're so tangled up in these definitions now, you have to go back to the foundational biology.
To the hardwiring.
To the hardwiring, not the cultural software we've layered on top over the centuries.
Okay, let's do it. Let's start in the deepest part of the trench. This modern distinction between biological gender and social gender. It's the cornerstone of almost every current discussion.
It is. And yet the research we're examining, it challenges that distinction aggressively.
How so?
Well, from a purely biological and cognitive perspective, the argument is that separating the two is fundamentally scientifically unsound.
Unsound, that's a strong word.
The source material uses an even stronger one. It calls the separation nonsensical within an evolutionary context.
Okay, hang on. If they're calling it nonsensical, how do they account for, the last 50 years of social science that built that very framework? What's the specific flaw they're pointing to?
It's about how the brain works. The sources argue that yes, nature is messy. It has what they call fuzzy indefinite regions. Not everyone is 100% textbook male or female.
Sure, that makes sense.
But, and this is the key, human cognition needs categories to survive. Our brains evolved to work with two primary ones, male and female. Everything we now call a social role simply evolved as a functional expression of those two biological structures.
So the roles aren't arbitrary.
They're not seen as arbitrary constructs. They're the survival strategies that are physically and neurologically linked to those two different biological architectures.
So if the default is this functional difference rooted in survival, what does that mean for our modern idea of equality? Is trying to make everything the same even the right goal?
That's where the sources present a really powerful critique. They basically frame this push for literal sameness as a purely human intellectual invention.
Not something you see in nature.
You don't. Nothing in nature is truly equal. And they go further, arguing that trying to force things to be equal to equate fundamentally different systems can be the greatest form of cruelty.
Cruelty. Now that's a provocative claim. How is pursuing fairness a form of cruelty?
It's about the rigidity of it. Our idea of balance is often, too, mechanical. Nature's balance is adaptive. When we impose a mechanical equality, we ignore all the inherent differences.
And that's the cool part.
Yes, because it forces different systems, whether it's two people or the two sexes, to compete on one single narrow metric. And that guarantees that one of them has to fail, or, as the sources say, suffer a form of torture.
Can you give me a real-world example of that, even just within one group?
Absolutely. Let's take two men. If you decide their value is based only on how fast they can run a 100-meter sprint, one will be a success and the other failure.
Right.
Even if that slower man is brilliant at social negotiation or resource management skills that are just as vital for survival. Different lives, different wiring, it all dictates inequality in specific tasks.
And that complexity just explodes when you try to mandate that kind of sameness between two whole populations like male and female.
Exactly, and that's what the absurdity of it really shows. You see it when people talk about forcing 50-50 representation in all jobs.
You're talking about the more physically asymmetric roles.
Yes, things like sewer workers, masons, deep-sea diving, jobs that have been traditionally male-dominated because of, average differences in strength or lung capacity. The moment you demand 50% representation there, it's not about social bias anymore.
It's about practicality and safety.
It's pure biological practicality. The sources are clear that this kind of mandatory 50-50 math is an attempt to flatten a complex reality, and it's ultimately destructive.
So the evidence suggests that when you remove those societal pressures, these natural inclinations actually, they surface more strongly.
That's exactly what the empirical data shows. You look at the most egalitarian countries in the world, the ones who have worked the hardest to remove social interference from career choices.
You'd expect the choices to converge.
You would, if it was all just cultural programming. But you see the opposite. You see divergence. Young men still gravitate heavily towards technical, task-focused fields, engineering, physics, And young women still predominantly choose supportive, people-focused fields, nursing, psychology, teaching.
That's fascinating because it really does challenge that core assumption that if you just remove the bias, the outcomes will be identical.
It suggests preference is innate, not just imposed. It suggests that these differences in, say, risk aversion or interest, they're rooted in neurobiology, and they come out when people have genuine freedom of choice.
So this moves us away from sameness and toward, yeah, well, a different principle entirely. If it's not a quality, what's the model that made our species so successful?
The organizing principle is complementarity. Human diversity, the fact that we aren't all the same, is the reason Homo sapiens became the dominant organism on the planet.
That's so.
We operate as a unified system, a superorganism. It works because individuals with different, often asymmetric, strengths can assemble into these incredibly effective units to achieve common goals.
Let's get a bit more technical there. How does that complementarity show up at, say, the neurobiological level?
Well, we can see observable structural differences, things like variations in brain connectivity.
Yeah.
For instance, the relative thickness and activity of the corpus callosum, which links the two hemispheres.
Oh, I see.
And there are also well-documented differences in how the prefrontal cortex handles things like risk assessment or social processing. These aren't small things. They're traits that predisposed ancestral groups to a kind of functional asymmetry.
One group better at one type of task, the other better at another.
Statistically, yes. One population was, on average, better equipped for high-risk, long-range tasks like hunting. The other was better equipped for the stability, organization, and emotional cohesion of the immediate community.
So the division of labor wasn't imposed on people, it sort of co-evolved with us.
It's an integrated system. The analogy the sources use is beautiful. It's like a fruit and its seed.
Right.
We eat the fruit and we throw away the seed. We want seedless grapes, seedless watermelon. We see the seed as an annoyance. But the fruit exists only to propagate that seed. They aren't two competing things.
They're a single unified system.
A co-evolved system. And that's the model for male and female evolution. A necessary, survival-driven division of labor built on complementary differences, where you need both parts for the whole thing to work.
So if this is our natural state, our factory setting, why is there so much conflict and confusion today? Why are we fighting against our own design?
That's the question, isn't it? It's the central conflict of our time. Modern lives, our cities, our information systems, it's almost totally disconnected from the natural world our brains evolved in.
We built an artificial matrix.
And now we're fighting inside it, forgetting the natural laws that still govern us. The sources say we have to return to basics. We have to understand the biological context to solve the conflict.
And what's making that return so difficult is this media environment, which seems to be an engine for reshaping how we think.
It's the single most powerful environmental force of the last 100 years. For 60, 70 years, media has been actively shaping our minds, and often it bypasses our conscious thought.
Through cognitive biases.
Exactly. Simple repetition makes an idea feel true. That's cognitive ease. And if you package a concept with scientific-sounding words, we're wired to just accept it without doing the hard work of critical thinking.
And the speed is just... it's accelerating.
We're living in what the sources call the hyperbolic effect. Social norms that used to take generations to change can now shift in a few hours on a social media platform.
It's like a stock market of ideas, constantly crashing.
It is, and it demands all of our attention. We're just not evolutionarily prepared for this level of rapid, high-stress manipulation.
Yeah.
It's fueling so much of the conflict.
The sources put a number on it. Something like 85% of what we think and believe is influenced by this mediatic pumping.
Yeah.
That figure is just staggering.
It is, but it shows you the incredible power of environment. You think about it on a smaller scale. You take someone and you move them from one country to another. Within a few years, their entire communication style changes. Their stress responses, their thought patterns. Their brain adapts to the new signals from their environment. Now imagine that on a global scale, with a media ecosystem constantly feeding us new definitions of normal.
So if we're in this deep conflict, what's the solution? Is it revolution? Do we tear down the structures?
Nature doesn't really do revolution. It does evolution. Gradual change driven by necessity. Systems that hold on to traits that no longer work, behaviors that hinder survival or productivity, they just get filtered out over time. We learn when we have to.
And what's the big pressure point now? What's forcing that next evolutionary step for us?
Artificial intelligence. AI is going to massively accelerate the rate of adaptation we need to function as a society.
How so?
The argument is that AI will essentially force us to become polite and smart, and to do it much faster than we would have otherwise. You just can't wield that much technological power with the kind of emotional volatility and, frankly, intellectual sloppiness that's so common right now.
So the way forward is actually intellectual. It's a path of self-knowledge.
That is the path to achieving true refa. And when we say refa, we don't just mean money. We mean total societal welfare, a high quality of life. The old wisdom, know thyself, has never been more relevant.
By understanding our factory settings.
Yes, at the individual, family, and species level. When you work with your design, you increase your constructive abilities, and you can't help but reduce conflict and destructiveness.
Can this work on a really small scale, like just in a household?
It dramatically improves domestic harmony. When partners, and often it's the woman who takes on the managerial role of the household, when they understand the innate neurobiological differences in how male and female brains process stress or communication,
The conflict just goes down.
it decreases significantly because you start to understand the operating system of your partner. You see their difference as a resource, not a flaw to be fixed. Trying to source each other to be the same just creates friction. Managing the differences creates a sustainable, happy system.
So the whole structure really does hinge on dissonance, but for a lot of people listening, that might still sound like a justification for a hierarchy. How do the sources balance that?
That's a critical point. The complementary structure is necessary for survival, but that is not the same thing as a value hierarchy.
Yeah.
The strength of the superorganism is that all the essential functions are seen as equally necessary, the task-focused role and the relational-focused role. The value is on the contribution to the whole, not the specific type of work. A successful system has to value managing the internal environment just as highly as it values achieving external goals. One can't survive without the other.
This challenges so much of how we think. I think the takeaway for you listening is that we have to question our definition of success, of harmony, that true societal welfare, refa, it might not come from this mechanical equality, but from understanding and honoring the biological complementarity that made us who we are.
And that leads to a final and I think a critical question for all of us. If societal change is evolutionary and AI is forcing us to adapt at this incredible new speed, what specific human behaviors we see all around us now that are considered normal or even celebrated in our media environment? What behaviors will become fundamentally non-adaptive and maybe even obsolete in the very near future?
That is a profound thought to end on. Thank you for walking us through such a complex and necessary conversation.
The pleasure was all mine. Let's continue to understand ourselves.